Hi, I'm Ro Allen. I'm the Victorian Equal Opportunity Human Rights Commissioner in Australia. And before that, I was Victoria's first LGBTIQ Commissioner. So I was born in Glen Waverley, in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. My family and I have a place in Violet Town. I'm married and have a 17-year-old who's just finished high school and two stepsons from my wife's previous marriage and a granddaughter of the age of 2. So a real modern family. My wife is older than me, and so when we were together she said, if you want to be a parent, I've done that. My time is done, I'll have to do that. We hadn't been together very long at all, so she thought that that conversation was extraordinary. She said, I'll ring you back in 2 hours, and rang me back and said, look, I don't know what's going to happen with us, but you should progress this because, you know, everyone who wants to be a parent should have a right to be a parent. I wasn't expecting to carry a child, so that was quite a journey for a non-binary person. I think I was the only pregnant person that nobody stood up for on a tram. They just thought I was a man with a beer gut. And when I got to the hospital in labour, the receptionist went up and I said, I'm having a baby. And she said, where's your wife, sir? And I'm like, no, I'm having a baby. And she just kept saying, yes, I understand that. I'll get the wheelchair. Where's your wife? And I'm just like... So I grew up in the Uniting Church. It was united at that point, so the Methodist and Presbyterian congregationists had come together. I just grew up with the Uniting Church. I've got so much to thank them for. There's such a social justice focus. My faith has a lot to do with the foundations of the work that I do. And I see my work as a vocation. It's not just, you know, a job. Social justice and human rights has been in my DNA and in my veins from a very small age. So the church was somewhere where you know, I came out. You know, I had the messaging that this was not normal, this was not okay. And in fact, when I was 15, I went and found an evangelical church for a while because the music was better than the pipe organs in the Uniting Church. That's where I experienced conversion practice, or the idea that they could pray away the gay. And so at the age of 15, you know, it was a very scary experience to have like a full-blown exorcism at the floor of a very large Pentecostal, you know, warehouse kind of church, with 4 very large men pinning me down on the ground, speaking in tongues, trying to exorcise demons. Well, needless to say, that didn't work. Again, back in the Uniting Church, my life truly was saved by the most extraordinary woman, Reverend Dorothy McRae-McMahon. You may have read some of her liturgies. She's the most amazing woman. She's still with us in Sydney, and she was the director of mission for the Uniting Church, and she saw me at a conference and she just recognised me, you know, and showed me really clearly that it wasn't a choice between my sexuality and my spirituality. It literally saved my life. But as we know, many young LGBTIQ people that are involved in faith organisations or not, get the messaging that somehow we're broken, somehow we need fixing, and it's not always a happy ending. Sometimes they, the self-harm and suicide in that, but sometimes they just lose their faith communities. Fast forward, you know, from that 15-year-old young person to being, you know, Australia's, but based in Victoria's first LGBTIQ commissioner was extraordinary, and then to actually work on legislation to outlaw change and suppression or conversion practices in Victoria was a really powerful moment to talk to my 15-year-old self and say, well, there you go, sorted. At the time, they were advertising for a Human Rights Commissioner, and I just said something like, gee, I hope the Human Rights Commissioner takes care of my brand new legislation. And my wife said, oh, well, actually, my then partner, now wife, that we have marriage equality in Australia, said, why don't you apply for it? So, yeah, now I'm looking after everybody's human rights in Victoria, which is an absolute honour. Coming out in the Uniting Church, I was very involved. I'd grown up in the youth groups, I'd led youth camps, and I was on what was called a National Christian Youth Convention, which was about 3,000 young people, and I'd led a group to Canberra for the convention, and literally came out to myself properly and to almost a crowd at that time, because they had a gay man who had HIV talking on the stage not about homosexuality, just about you living with HIV and the discrimination experienced. And then after that evening, people were, you know, like there was really mixed emotions about, you know, the theologians in the group that said that should never have happened, we should never expose kids to that, to the others. And I found myself arguing, you know, all of a sudden in the first person about LGBTI people. And I went, okay. So, you know, yeah, I lost friends, Christian friends, and picked up others and found that there was a network of queer folk in the church. So from representatives from every country in Asia and Pacific, many of them were part of the LGBTI community. We'd found each other at those kind of events. I think it's when you have to do your personal work, when you have to actually realise that you're not mainstream, and you know, your emotional intelligence is tested and stretched at a young age, then you look at the world. You can look outside yourself and contribute in a way. And I think many LGBTIQ people can give back and do that. Yeah, I moved back to Australia and into working for Uniting, which is the agency of the church, and built an organisation in rural Victoria, Shepparton. So I ran the first rural group then, and then could see, you know, the discrimination I experienced for that. And I thought, well, you can either stop or crank it up. And I'm a crank it up kind of person. So I thought, if this kind of physical vandalism of my car, lemons on the roof of my house, you know, physical assaults, if that all happens to me, this will be happening to other people. How do we do something systemically? We drive to Melbourne regularly and, you know, infiltrated, I suppose, is probably a bit of a hard word, but the Youth Affairs Council of Victoria, until I was chair, until we lobbied government to get statewide programs for rural. I was working as a youth worker and then manager of a youth service, you know, dragging kids out of the river, right? One kid after the next, taking them to psych services, trying to find them housing. I'm 21. I'm young. So I'm not much older than the young people that I'm assisting. And but I could already see that this was fruitless effort. Like, if you didn't actually change the root cause, which is the homophobia and transphobia, and do something systemically, you're just going to keep dragging these kids. Getting a health strategy for Victoria for same-sex attracted kids, getting youth workers trained, you know, because every gay kid got sent to me. Well, that was a crazy outcome. Like, that's not sustainable. Yeah, very proud of that work. We got that expanded under the Liberal government, so it was bipartisan. You know, it's recurrent funding for LGBTIQ young people across the state. Never going to be enough money in the bucket, but it's a couple of $1 million a year to fund services. And, you know, there's a whole of government LGBTIQ strategy now in Victoria. So we're leading the way. There's no question we're leading the way, and we're still the first state, only state, that has an LGBTI commissioner. So that was a really powerful role. But yeah, working in the church, coming out in the church, you know, it was an interesting time. I candidated for ministry and had to come, you know, like, you go through the congregation. This is when I was not out. I go through the congregation and I got, you know, swept through the presbytery, which is like the region, up to the synod level, which is the state level. And that's where I told them that I was queer. And they went, whoa. And apparently there's no hierarchy in the Uniting Church. So they're all, you know, meant to be all, you know, coordinated congregation, presbytery, whatever. So they said, oh, we can't make this decision, back to presbytery. And of course presbytery voted, and I just got over the line. But it was the most demoralising experience to sort of stand up the front while they all just looked at me and thought about it. And again, not that old. What I would have been 21 or something. You know, and all these strategies about don't bring your girlfriend because all they'll be thinking about is you two in bed. Like, it's just crazy stuff. You're thinking, crikey. I had the very visceral lived experience of that kind of, you know, it jumped you straight back to that 15-year-old with the 4 men pinning you down and giving you an exorcism, right? To 21, and now these people are deciding your future. You know, not that different to the postal survey, where all of Australia got to decide whether we could marry or not. The postal survey, that was 3 months, and the relief at the end to have a yes vote. It was a devastating day when the Voice referendum went down. No minority group should have their human rights tested by Australians, by majority people, in the secrecy of a ballot box. Racism is real. and not having bipartisan support, that was always destined to fail. So it was a devastating experience to watch that happen. So I'm not a believer in working out who is more disadvantaged in the Disadvantaged Olympics. We have in Victoria an Equal Opportunity Act with 21 protected attributes: sex, race, disability, breastfeeding, etc. And they're all, very different. And of course, you're not, as a person, you're not necessarily just one of those protected attributes. If you're a Muslim woman, you're protected by your gender as a woman from misogyny, but also a race and religion is protected as well. I think the experiences are absolutely different. If you are LGBTIQ like myself, I still hold an enormous amount of white privilege. Part of the LGBTIQ backlash was that we didn't really focus on trans and non-binary people. We put up the white, shiny gay men with their dog and their two high-flying jobs, and we put up the older white middle-class lesbians going to the opera. That's the image we put up of the couples. We didn't put up what I would call all of the LGBTIQ community. So I think there was racism even in our Sell campaign, because the campaign people understood that racism was real. So they did the job to get marriage equality for everyone. So I wasn't surprised by the Voice, particularly when not all First Nations people supported it. So it did make it very confusing for people who didn't understand it at all. And the fear factor was pretty big. I mean, the campaign before the marriage equality campaign, people supported marriage equality up in the 80%, and then it came down to 60%. We've got a lot of work to do around racism. But the majority should never decide human rights of the minority. Being LGBTIQ, being queer, so, for me, a non-binary, person, I think is my superpower. I really do feel the future is non-binary. My workplace, so the Human Rights Commission, just undertook what's called a 360 review of me. So a 360 review is when, all these people review you, your subordinates, your leaders and your peers. One of my commissioner colleagues has just filled in the survey, but then had a conversation with me about what he'd observed as a non-binary person. He said, you can go into a room of men, Ro, and completely be accepted, get rapport, get what you need out of that group. Nobody takes your opinion and counts it as their own, And likewise, you can move into a group of women and just morph into that conversation smoothly and easily. And in groups of people, everyone can feel comfortable. You have a way to be able to do that. Now, I think that's not just about being non-binary, but it's certainly part of my neurodiversity. I'm dyslexic as well, and I think what I pick up and I read a room really quickly is the way my brain works. So I think that's part of it, and part of my identity is being non-binary. So I've always used it as a strength. I think having a lived experience of disadvantage, I haven't got jobs in the past because of my sexuality. I haven't, progressed or done things because of that. I've had barriers. I've certainly had physical assault. I've had verbal assaults. I've been spat on. So I've had all of that. And, I've had hate mail and death threats. So that lived experience drives my desire, because I know if it's happening to me, it's happening to somebody else that's not as processed and strong, and someone that doesn't have the white privilege and the middle class privilege that I have. So why that stuff still happens, it's a driving force for my social justice bent. There are all sorts of forms of disadvantage. So language evolves. I didn't wake up and go, yes, I'm non-binary. But I knew I didn't fit into the gender stereotypes. So I came out as lesbian, and all the the categories that go with that, butch, lesbian, whatever, that's, you know. I think I was always non-binary and the term arrived. Because nothing really felt right. My sexuality is monosexual, which means I'm attracted to one sex, which is women. The diversity existed, already existed, always existed, and is meant to exist. Understanding the very special place of sovereign people. We have, you know, Indigenous cultures that are under incredible risk globally, and we need to understand their sovereignty for the land. Understand that we are, you know, all migrants in Australia beyond First Nations people, and we need to strive for truth and reconciliation. In Victoria, we've just signed a treaty with First Nations people after years of listening, and the Yurok truth-telling. You know, that's really important. Part of a treaty is understanding the truth, understanding the history and owning it. Not having, as a white person, having to apologise for everything my ancestors. It's not about apologies. It's about understanding that and learning from that and making sure we don't do those things again, and giving self-determination to First Nations people, that they can decide their future around school, education, healthcare, etc. Because the outcomes can't get worse. And when you put care into the hands of community know how to care for their community. We're going to get a better outcome. Treaty is going to be an absolute turning point, I think, in Victoria. And there's the statewide treaty, but then every local native title group will then make a separate treaty with the areas, which I think will be fantastic. And I just hope Australia as a whole picks this up, does the truth-telling journey and the hard work. It's not easy. Truth is difficult to listen to. Do that hard work and get on with a national treaty. Gullenwall is the name of the new organisation in Victoria that will supersede the First Peoples Assembly that was set up to create the treaty or negotiate the treaty with government. Will go into that, as well as an ongoing truth-telling process as well. So, and that's now in legislation, which is amazing. I think Australia's position in the world is really critical. We're really right across many of the partnerships globally. And we are leading the way, and we need to keep telling people about that. I think we have to keep that work front and centre and keep talking to particularly the Pacific nations, particularly around justice issues. I think you've got to be careful. I mean, countries need to do their own work. You can't force it and be a colonialist, you know, knock, knock, here I am, I'm going to come in on a white horse and do all this social justice work. But countries can learn from each other. And I think we need to be in those dialogues. So I was asked last night, where am I going to be in 5 years? It'll be a different platform, same purpose. I spoke about Dorothy McRae-McMahon. She taught me a lesson around revolutionary patience. Revolutionary patience is something that it's a mantra that I use when I'm being discriminated against or I see injustice, hatred in the world. And I think about revolutionary patience, and I breathe in and I breathe out, and I'll say it again, and I'll breathe in and I'll breathe out, and that's what drives me.